My name is Zechariah Etheridge, and I will be discussing the Santa Cruz Massacre that took place on November 12th of 1991 in East Timor. On this date, over 270 East Timorese citizens were massacred at the Santa Cruz Cemetery in Dili by Indonesian troops. A lot of these people who were slaughtered were youngsters who were rallying around the memorial procession, which was honoring the death of Sebastião Gomez, a young man who was also slain by the Indonesian military. However, in order to understand how this massacre came to be, one must understand the colonial history of East Timor, and it all starts with the Portuguese. The Portuguese colonized East Timor in the 16th century, and from that point on, East Timor was known as Portuguese Timor. The rest of the island of Timor was referred to as West Timor, and the other islands that were colonized by the Dutch between the 17th and 19th centuries later became Indonesia, and were also known as the Dutch East Indies. Although Portugal was neutral during World War II, in December of 1941, Portuguese Timor was occupied by Australian and Dutch forces. At this time, they were actually expecting an invasion from the Japanese military, who was doing a lot of colonization and occupying of other countries during this time. When the Japanese did occupy Timor in February 1942, the East Timorese allies and plenty of indigenous volunteers did not have access to the same weapons and technology as the Japanese did when it came time to fight back. Therefore, they engaged them in a guerrilla campaign. While this did prove somewhat successful in fending off the Japanese, it resulted in the death of 40,000 to 70,000 Timorese civilians. This lasted from 1942 to 1943, a relatively short war. It's now referred to as the Battle of Timor. The Portuguese regained control of Portuguese Timor after this war, but Portugal continued to neglect the colony. They invested very little in infrastructure, education, as well as healthcare. Many of the schools there were poorly funded, and a lot of the students lacked the proper supplies in order to receive the education they needed. Many people were not even using the university that was there. The colony was officially declared an overseas province of the Portuguese Republic in 1955, although authority did rest with the Portuguese governor. During this time, Indonesia did not express any interest in Portuguese Timor, despite the anti-colonial rhetoric of their leader, President Sukarno. This was partly because Indonesia was preoccupied with gaining control of West Papua in New Guinea, which had been retained by the Netherlands after Indonesian independence. Something that's worth noting is that at the United Nations, Indonesian diplomats stressed that their country did not seek control over any territory outside the former Netherlands East Indies. Explicitly, they mentioned Portuguese Timor. Portuguese Timor at this time was in a fragile state, both socially and economically. Fast forwarding some 30 years, in 1974, after the fall of the Portuguese fascist regime, independence was encouraged by the new democratic Portuguese government. One of the first acts of the new government in Lisbon was to appoint a new governor for the colony on November 18th of 1974, who was named Mario Lemos Perez, who would ultimately be the last governor of Portuguese Timor. One of his first decrees made upon his arrival in Dili was to legalize political parties in preparation for elections to a constituent assembly in 1976. Three main political parties were formed that proved very influential to the development of the country. The first was Timorese Democratic Union. They supported traditional political characters and sought out a gradual approach to independence. The second was the Timorese Social Democratic Association, or ASDT, who later changed their name to the Revolutionary Front of Independence of East Timor. They were after a radical and rapid approach towards independence, and their leader was Fretilin, who was accused by many of having Marxism in his regime. The last very influential political party that rose up was the Timorese Popular Democratic Association, otherwise known as APODT. They supported integration with Indonesia and wanted to operate as a union with that province. However, they had very little grassroots support. One of their popular leaders was Abilio Oceoro Soares, who later served as the last Indonesian appointed governor of East Timor. As these independent parties grew more successful, the developments in Portuguese, including the political regimes that were not as influential, were monitored, and their success in Timor were watched closely by Indonesia and Australia from 1974 through 1975. Frei Tillon and his regime seemed to be gaining a lot of support within the colony and was very inspirational to other colonies across the world who were wanting to move towards independence, such as Aceh, West Irian, and the Moluccas. Frei Tillon and the UDT emerged as the largest parties, having previously formed an alliance to campaign for independence. Indonesian military intelligence, otherwise known as Bakin, began attempting to cause divisions between the pro-independence parties and to promote the support of Aphrodite. During the course of 1975, Portugal became increasingly detached from political developments in its colony, becoming embroiled in civil unrest and political crises, and were more concerned with decolonization in their African colonies of Angola and Mozambique than with Portuguese Timor. Many local leaders saw independence as something that was unrealistic and not likely to happen. They were open to discussions with Jakarta over Portuguese Timor's incorporation into the Indonesian state. East Timor was left in such a state of disarray that many of the local leadership there felt as if they could not sustain themselves if they did gain independence. However, due to centuries of oppression by colonial powers, East Timor did fight back for their independence, which ultimately led to a violent political uprising by much of the youth there, as well as the political regimes who had combined forces. As Charles Tilley and Frantz Fanon explained, the effects of decolonization ultimately led to the political regimes who were representing the country itself, the rebel groups, fighting back against the colonial powers, which in this case were Indonesia, who had formerly occupied East Timor. This is what ultimately led to the Santa Cruz Massacre, in which not only were plenty of adults killed, a large portion of the victims of this massacre were people who were under 18. They were kids and they were children, and the only way to explain these violent effects is to understand the violent history of Eastern Timor. Frantz Fanon explains how the effects of decolonization are just as violent and destructive as the effects of colonization. While the indigenous population of Eastern Timor struggled to regain political and economic sovereignty, they had to navigate the colonial powers of Indonesia as well as the prior colonial powers of the Dutch. Their economy, which was formerly based on sandalwood and now and still is based on coffee, had to be rehabilitated. They had to establish a political regime who they could trust and who the country supported and knew would not be corrupted by wealthy European politicians. The work of Charles Tilley, as we've discussed in our class, has done wonders in helping me to understand the political situation of East Timor. During this time period, Eastern Timor is not unique in their secession from the Indonesian colonial rule. While civil wars across the world were winding down, war-sized conflicts, such as the one that took place in East Timor, were still occurring. In sum, we can see how the convoluted and sporadic history of East Timor contributed to the massacre that took place at Santa Cruz in 1991. Events like this one can appear to come out of nowhere. However, they're seated in hundreds of years of colonial oppression, societal discontent, and cultural repression. I've come to know that we're not rid of events like this. It's just that we're not privy to this information due to the bias in the media that we tend to watch. One thing I found interesting during my research was that the United States became involved only after the Santa Cruz Massacre. The U.S. did have information about what was going on in that territory, but chose not to involve themselves. They had expressed concerns over Portuguese Timor, otherwise known as East Timor, in the wake of the war in Vietnam, but having gained Indonesia as an ally, Washington did not want to see them destabilized by a left-wing regime in its midst. Nevertheless, organizations there who are monitoring trade in arms have estimated that between 1992 and 1997, the United States sold more than $1 billion worth of arms to Indonesia. This seems to be a little interesting to me, considering they could have used those arms in the wake of the war. This goes to show that the Santa Cruz Massacre that took place is nothing that's very unique. This is just one example of collective violence that's taking place throughout history that we should use as a site to study in order to apply nonviolence and keep acts of violence like this from happening again.